In one of the most popular videos on my channel, I explored what we knew about the outer gods of Elden Ring, mysterious, godlike entities that influence the game world from behind the scenes. Despite a number of references, none of them seem to directly appear in-game. Their ranks consist of such great figures as the Greater Will, the Frenzied Flame, the Formless Mother, and more, and they can be found in close association with many of the most important and powerful figures in the game, from Queen Marika to the Fire Giant to Melania, Blade of Miquella. But with such an influential presence, it does seem odd that we never seem to see any of the outer gods themselves. Which may lead us to the question, are the outer gods actually real? Or are they something else, some collective creation of presence or myth? Are they the stories of folklore told by the people of the lands between? In this video, I will explore a few of the outer gods to try to find out the answer to this question. Are the outer gods of the lands between real? For this investigation, I want to look at three outer gods, the Greater Will, the Formless Mother, and the Rot God. And I may briefly touch on a few others too. The Greater Will is a prime candidate because it is the most prominently featured outer god in the game, standing at the top of the Golden Order and ostensibly speaking to us through the Two Fingers. The Formless Mother will provide us with information about how the outer gods may or may not physically exist in the world, and lastly, the Rot God will show some of the most tangible effects attributed to this Lovecraftian race of godlike beings. And before we get started, a thank you to those who support me on Patreon, and a reminder that if you enjoy the video and my content, feel free to become a patron or just subscribe to the channel to support my work and keep up to date with any new content I send out. Any form of support helps the channel keep going. With that, let us dive into the reality of the outer gods. First and foremost among the outer gods is unquestionably the Greater Will. It is the patron and guiding god of the Golden Order, the main faction in power in the lands between. It is the head which supposedly controls God Queen Marika, the Elden Beast, the Two Fingers, and the rest of the Order. In trying to determine if an outer god is not simply the case of a mistaken identity or myth built up around some natural phenomena, we need to look at both the attributed actions and influence and any relevant item descriptions. For the Greater Will, it would make sense to look at Queen Marika as a starting off point, but despite her comments on the Golden Order we hear from Melina, we never actually hear Marika speak directly about the Greater Will or see any explicit reference made between them. Even when discussing Marika and her punishment for shattering the Order, Enya does not mention the Greater Will, only that,
"But even in shackles, she remains a god and the vision's vessel."
While Marika rebelled against the Order, it seems unlikely that she would have been a god under a being that did not exist, and her words from Melina about searching the Golden Order make it seem like she is trying to understand something greater than her that has structured the religion she heads. All of this, plus her imprisonment, makes a case for the Greater Will, but maybe that role could still be fulfilled by the Elden Beast, with the Greater Will simply being a fanciful story. So it seems Marika will not lead us to further answers. Instead, let's look at where else we come across the Greater Will throughout the game. We first hear of the Greater Will almost immediately upon starting, at the end of the intro cinematic, where the narrator describes the shattering of the Elden Ring and the following wars. These wars led to, quote, abandonment by the Greater Will, end quote. That is where we start the game, so the Greater Will does get an excuse to not take too active of a role in the game's main events, despite being the head of the Order. We see from this description that the Greater Will is given a fairly concrete characterization, as something which can abandon the land. We see more of this in key item descriptions too. The Elden Star's incantation states explicitly that the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between. And the Elden Remembrance states that the Elden Beast was the vassal beast of the Greater Will. All of these instances talk about the Greater Will in a very active voice. This manner of speech is echoed by Enya as she speaks for and about the Two Fingers. She says that the Greater Will
has not abandoned the realm,
and that the Greater Will has long denounced the demigods. She even characterizes the Greater Will in real time, saying such things as that it is
pleased,
and that the Fingers are actively consulting with it. However, we see that the Fingers go stiff and silent. Even Enya remarks that they are dormant, severing our link to the Greater Will. Enya clearly believes that the Greater Will is a real, tangible thing that can influence the world or at least speak through the Two Fingers. But maybe that is just an artifact of something naturally occurring within the Two Fingers. Maybe Enya is a religious fanatic of a non-existent god. We could try viewing things that way, but it is hard to look at all of the instances that refer to the greater will and not see something real acting. But maybe with at least the greater will, there could be another kind of explanation. I forget where I originally saw this theory, maybe from a YouTube comment, so I'm not claiming to have come up with it myself. But the theory goes that we could see the greater will as a kind of product of the wills of the people in the lands between. It could be a kind of transcendental entity that exists through the collective consciousness of all the people and creatures of the world. This would make it real, but a product of people, not some independently existing god figure. Now, this might sound like a pretty out there theory, I know, but we can find some support for it. It can find basis in the fact that Elden Ring and From Software in general takes great inspiration from the fantasy manga Berserk. There are plenty of direct references to the manga in previous Souls games, and especially in Elden Ring, from the Great Sword to the Sword's monuments to Crystal Tears and more. And this line of thinking about the greater will could come from something in Berserk too. To not get too spoilery about the manga, in Berserk there is a semi-canonical entity that is a kind of desired god, which represents the will of the essence of humankind. It is an amalgamation of the subconscious wills of people, something which was formed from people and then influences them back. In Berserk's case, it weaves the destiny of humanity, giving reason to the pain and suffering of the world. It directs the world and the flow of events, which is called causality in the manga. This causality is an extremely central theme throughout the work, especially in how people seem to either be led by it or try to make their own fate. Back in Elden Ring, with the law of causality as a core tenet of the Greater Will's Golden Order, the similarities make this theory seem a little bit more plausible. If the Greater Will operates in a similar role, it could be a real thing, but it is something spawned from the people and then acts as a kind of superseding will influencing events and the flow of the world. Even out of the name Greater Will comes support for the idea that it is some form of higher will derived from a collective will of individuals. That collective will coming together to override and constitute a kind of greater will. In this case, the being could still do everything we see attributed to it in-game, but we can now view all of these actions in a new context. Though past these thematic connections, we don't have much additional support for the theory, as there aren't that many in-game revelations about the nature of the greater will. A deeper dive solely into the greater will may reveal some things, but in context of deciding whether it is real or not, either of the options we've seen would answer in a similar way. The greater will could be a traditional alien godlike entity like a bigger elden beast or something just larger than that in space, or it could be something seemingly supernatural but spawned from the mortals of the world. In either case, it is still in existence and influencing the world in a real way. This seems to be a matter of fact, and there seem to be too many instances of it acting in-game for it to be explained away as myth or folklore. But we could still use some more evidence to really solidify things, so let's look at our other Outer God candidates to see if they can help paint the picture. At the opposite end of the hierarchy of the Golden Order, below its sewers and outcasts in the bottom of Leyndell, we can find the Omen Mohg communing with another outer being, the Formless Mother, also known as the Mother of Truth. This is a more reclusive entity, who we only learn of through its connection with Mohg and blood-based weaponry. The Blood Boon incantation lays out the picture, stating, "The Mother of Truth craves wounds. When Mohg stood before her, deep underground, his accursed blood erupted with fire, and he was besotted with the defilement that he was born into." So we see a connection formed from the cursed blood that Mohg was born with. The spell also explains a bit about how the connection works when it says, "Sacred incantation of Mohg, Lord of Blood. Thrust arm into the body of the Formless Mother, then scatter the blood flame to set the area ablaze." The animation shows the player or Mohg seemingly reach into another dimension and summon power along with fire and a blood splatter. We see something similar in Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear, the weapon of Mohg. Its skill is Blood Boon Ritual, which is essentially a more grandiose version of the previous spell, whereby the body of the Formless Mother is pierced 3 times, creating explosions of blood with each thrust. The spear also gives a bit of exposition too, saying, as well as serving as a weapon, it is an instrument of communion with an outer god, who bestows power upon accursed blood. The Mother of Truth desires a wound. There is the explicit reference of it as an outer god. So if we were to question the validity of the Formless Mother being an outer god, We don't have a lot of ground to work with, as the game does explicitly call it such. Though, with its connection to Mohg being through accursed blood, perhaps we could think of the mother as a kind of power source or natural reaction which certain people with the right blood type, like Omen maybe, can trigger or develop a connection with. We do after all see Mohg's twin, Morgott, who was always a devotee to the Order, using a blood flame attack in our battle with him. The Cursed Blood Slice is also the unique skill of Morgott's cursed sword. The connection between cursed Omen blood and blood flame may lend credence to the idea that certain people can connect with the Formless Mother, and Morgott would have never entered into a contract with an entity trying to subvert the Order, so this could support the idea that it is instead a natural phenomena or aspect of the world. This Mother of Truth could be an active being with wills and desires, or it could be a kind of feature of the natural world, but in either case it seems to have some kind of presence in another dimension. Mohg and the player are able to pierce its body and cast the associated spells from anywhere. This would only be possible if these rituals access another plane of existence, or if the Formless Mother permeates all of space. Either option would work with its name, as both would have it be formless in one way or another. While we do have two somewhat distinct options for what the Formless Mother could be, different but similar to the case of the Greater Will, as we had two options for that as well, they both seem to necessitate the actual existence of the Formless Mother. It doesn't seem that we can relegate the Mother of Truth to just a product of myth or folklore. Whether she be an actor from another dimension, or a characteristic of space in the lands between, she is something real. Lastly, we have the Rot God to look at. An outer god who comes up more on the peripheral, but has quite a few points of reference and influence, the most obvious of which is the Lake of Rot. We will see that this lake of decay and corrosion is one of the most tangible effects of an outer god, helping to cement the idea that they are indeed real. This is the case because the Lake of Rot is likely a direct product of the Rot God itself, and the Rot God may just be Rot itself. As we learned in my previous video on the Outer Gods, there is a sealed outer god of Scarlet Rot. The Blue Dancer charm tells us that the dancer in blue represents a fairy, who in legend bestowed a flowing sword upon a blind swordsman. Blade in hand, the swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was Rot itself. Now this does say in legend, so we might think it is talking about a myth or folk story, but there is evidence that it's real. We find the likely equipment of this blind swordsman in-game. The blue cloth set, the curved sword talisman, and the flowing curved sword all have environmental cues and descriptions which make them likely to have been the gear of the blind swordsman. And the prosthesis wearer heirloom leads us to believe that Melania, a demigod born cursed by Rot, was taught and mentored by the same blind swordsman, specifically one who had a flowing blade, which sounds just like the flowing curved sword, which is likely the blind swordsman's. With all of the specific references to this god and the inclusion of real people in the legends and stories that surround it, we essentially have no room to doubt that it is what it is described as. It was likely a real entity that could have actually been in the lands between, which, as we have come to learn, is rare for an outer god. In some fight or conflict, its stagnation was defeated by the flowing waters and blade of the blind swordsman, and it was sealed, though it still influences the world through its Lake of Rot and seeming ability to inflict curses on others, like Melania. As it is such a tangible being that directly interacted with the lands between and seems to have some supernatural degree of power, possibly by occupying or simply being all the rot in the world, some association in which the Rot God has some connection with any rot that appears anywhere, the outer god known as Rot seems to certainly exist. While I think we have seen from our listed examples that the outer gods do indeed seem to be real, I can't help but at least mention in passing the tangibility of the Fell God of the Fire Giants and the Frenzied Flame. The Fell God seems to literally be in the Fire Giant and maybe the rest of the giants too, from a few item descriptions, it not being in the stomachs of the trolls who betrayed the giants in favor of the Golden Order, and it appearing after the Fire Giant sacrifices his leg to the sky. It seems literally real and able to grant power and wreak destruction upon the world. It unquestionably satisfies conditions to be called real and something like an outer god, with mysterious power beyond the mere mortals of the lands between. And of course, the Frenzied Flame shows tangibility through allowing possession of dead bodies, being summoned by the Merchant Clan, its knowledge of the Greater Will and the One Great, and most clearly through its ending where its power burns the world and Erdtree. It is hard to characterize the Frenzied Flame as anything but an outer god, given its great power and clear desires of guiding the player down its path. Viewing the outer gods as a kind of in-game mythology is an interesting idea, and maybe some aspects of the stories surrounding them can be treated as such. Like, we maybe don't need to take every item description as 100% literal or plain fact, especially when some of them say, "in legend says," or "so it is said." But it does seem the outer gods are, in a lot of ways, truly real, and in some degrees, in power beyond the in-game characters. They are gods of great aspects that generally act behind the scenes, waiting for their time to influence the world. They may each constitute some different kind of form, being transcendental, a feature of space, or simply the essence of an element like rot. With their reality in mind, the search now is to figure out to what degree each one is real, and to catalog how they reveal themselves, especially in any future DLC. If you want to come along for that investigation or support it, you can become a patron on Patreon or subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me dedicate more time and effort into these videos, and you can get some perks to go along with it too, like early access to video scripts, and getting the chance to submit questions and Q&As, and more. With that, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the outer gods, their reality, and any other ideas I talked about. Thanks for watching, bye.